Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks to everybody for coming tonight. I feel it's really quite a moving occasion, because obviously there's a whole number of Iraqis here and other people who've suffered in all sorts of ways, and I also think there are a whole number of us who demonstrated and who protested 20 years ago and who've continued to do so over a whole range of issues. And actually, what we've done and what we've tried to do was to tell the truth 20 years ago, and it was that we were denied the ability to be listened to. And when you look at all the devastation that the previous speakers have talked about, when you read the newspapers this weekend and when you see the broadcasts, it's all put in terms of it was a mistake. I mean, it's interesting, the Times editorial headline that Andrew read out, historic mistake. Or that maybe it was a misadventure, as some people have called it. I think on the Today programme, that was one of their favourite terms for it. Now, I think we should be really, really clear about what we faced 20 years ago, and what people like us and many, many more people than us were saying, was that this was a deliberate war of choice by the biggest imperialist power in the world, backed by the historic colonial power in the Middle East, and that this was something they were absolutely determined to do. They were backed up and given their arguments by the Project for a New American Century, which is a thoroughly discredited bunch of right-wingers who were very, very close to George Bush and influenced George Bush in all sorts of ways. And that, as other people have said, one of the incredible things is that George Bush, was extremely wealthy before he became president. Tony Blair became much wealthier after he stopped being Prime Minister, partly because he was advising dictators all over the place who had similar records, if not worse, than Saddam Hussein. That was how he made his 50 million that he's supposed to be worth today. These people have made a fantastic amount out of the war, and Loki has explained all the many, many complications over all this kind of thing, but this was something they have not paid the price for anything that they did. And when I think particularly about Alistair Campbell, we talk about the media, I mean, Alistair Campbell's almost like a kind of agony uncle for the whole of the sort of liberal establishment. Gary Lineker, he's on the television saying about, yes, Gary Lineker's a really good guy. Nothing about the refugees who are the result of Blair's wars, the refugees from Afghanistan who are still suffering, the refugees from Iraq, the refugees from Syria, the refugees from all over the war-torn Middle East and South Asia. Those are the consequences of what those people did, and we should never ever forget that those are the consequences of what those people did. And it is incredible when you look now at that Times editorial. Are we going to, in another 20 years, have a headline about the Ukraine war or the encirclement of China that's going on at the moment, and the militarization which is growing in Europe and growing in the Pacific? Are we going to have a headline in 20 years saying, historic mistake, we shouldn't have gone to war round Ukraine, we shouldn't have gone to war round China, we shouldn't have done any of those sorts of things? Because if you look at it, and even lots of the commentators are now saying this, if you look at what is now happening, there is a pattern that went on. And somebody, I think Andrew said earlier, that this started in 2003. Actually, if you look at what happens, the period that opens up is after the first Gulf War, when you then get the sanctions on Iraq for 13 years, which are all a means of creating a situation when you can go to war. You then have the bombing of Yugoslavia, of Serbia, in 1999. That is a NATO operation, 78 days of bombing, a situation which makes NATO stronger and makes NATO in a much more powerful position in terms of its military intervention. You then have the expansion of NATO, particularly after the accession of the East European states in the early 2000s. So you have all those things going on. You have the doubling of arms spending in the last 20 years worldwide, $2 trillion now. are spent on arms, not just by the US and by Britain, but by China as well, by Russia as well, by Brazil, by Saudi Arabia, by a whole number of countries. You have the move towards militarism and war on a world scale. And that, I think, is what we are now seeing when we talk about the conflicts that are going on, the proxy war which is going on in Ukraine. And we all condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I condemn absolutely what is going on there. And that's why I think we have to have peace in Ukraine, and there have to be peace talks, and that is the demand that we've been putting forward. But it is also the case that you have the growth of the whole military operation which is going on. The doubling of Japanese military spending is something that's just been announced. The AUKUS Pact, which for the first time has given nuclear-powered submarines to Australia, at great cost, incidentally, to the Australian people, who no doubt suffer the same as people here and elsewhere in terms of the lack of resources for health and for housing and for education and for all of those things. So we have all those consequences going on, and they are very, very dangerous for us. I think when we look at Iraq 20 years ago, I think the invasion and occupation was hubris on the part of George Bush and Tony Blair, but actually it marked the beginning of the end of US hegemony. And that's why we're now seeing the growing conflicts, particularly the growing conflict they're trying to develop in terms of China. And this is the future that we have to face, and it's a very, very dangerous future that we have to face. And I think it's something, I mean, when Loki referred to the fact that, it's a very, very different situation from what we're in Iraq. That's true, but I also think that we are in a situation where the possibility of a major conflict between China and the US in particular, and the major conflict in Europe, have become much, much greater. And that is a very frightening prospect, because it is a prospect, as everybody here is aware, it's a prospect between major powers and each of them in control of nuclear weapons. Now, therefore, you see the dangers that are facing us in the world today, here in 2023. Now, what do we do about it? Well, it seems to me there's two things. Firstly, we have to fight on an ideological level, and that's made much harder by some of the things that have happened in the last year or two, made much, much harder by the way in which some of the Labour MPs took their names off the statement that Stop the War did a year ago. Makes it much, much harder for everybody to stand up against war when the people who are supposed to be the public figures and so on aren't willing to do so. That makes it much, much harder. But we should always remember that actually there are very large numbers of people who are very unhappy about what is going on in Ukraine, who are very unhappy about the increase in defence spending, who are very unhappy about all the things that are going on. And it's to those people we need to look in terms of building a movement. And in order to do so, this means we have to get out on the streets, we have to organise. As far as I'm concerned, even if there were 100 people on a demonstration, I think we have to do it at the moment, and I think it's extremely important to do it. We had a lot more than that. We had several thousand people on the demonstration last month. But we have to get these figures much, much bigger. We have to say to people, if they're saying they can't pay the nurses, they can't pay the teachers, they can't pay the rail workers, they can't pay all these people, we have to say to people, if that is their priority, and their priority is military spending, that priority is wrong. And we have to be out on the streets saying this. We have to be in meetings like this saying it. Because there is a connection between Iraq and what is going on now. That connection is imperialism, that connection is military expansion, that connection is the determination to go to war and to protect profit and to protect the elites and the richest in the world against the peoples of the world who are suffering so much, not just from war, from climate change, from poverty, from all the other things that people are suffering. So this is really my argument I want to put tonight, is to thank everybody for everything that we've all done over the last 20 years and how important that's been. But it's even more important to campaign and to organise now, because we are facing a much greater crisis than the war in Iraq. We predicted 20 years ago it would be like this. We're now finding that the world is in a very, very dangerous place. It's in a very dangerous place economically, it's in a very dangerous place militarily, and it's a very dangerous place that the people of the world have got to stand up. Working people across the world have got to stand up and fight back. I'm very pleased that we've had the strike wave that's going on at the moment. I wish we'd had it 20 years ago when we wanted to have people coming out and strike to stop the war. Unfortunately, the majority of people who did that were school students, which was fantastically impressive, but at the same time didn't have the same economic weight. We need now to build in the trade unions, to build inside the working class movement, to build in all the communities and make sure that we stop this warmongering and that we stop the wars and that we achieve a world of peace. If for no other reason than in memory and in solidarity with the people of Iraq who suffered so much over the last 20 years. Thanks.